We are very pleased to have with us today Christina Lundberg of the European Commission, from the Director General for International Partnerships and the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, to introduce the new European Union HRBA, or the Human Rights-Based Approach Toolbox. The European Union has been promoting a human rights-based approach to development cooperation for several years now. And very recently, it has updated its toolbox on the rights-based approach from 2014, in line with the commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals and to reducing all forms of inequalities, including gender inequality. The renewed human rights-based approach will help make interventions more inclusive and more sustainable. It applies to programming, design, and implementation of all sectors of EU external action. And the content of the toolbox will be presented, including what is a human rights-based approach to development cooperation and translating a human rights-based approach into practice, showing practical tools and examples. It promises to become a very interesting webinar with many participants from different countries. And we want to organize this webinar in an interactive manner. So if you have questions, you can send them to us via the Q&A and we will feed them into the discussion. This webinar is a joint organization of the Belgian Supporting Research Group on the Human Rights-Based Approach to Development Cooperation and the World Bank Working Group on Human Rights and Sustainable Development. The Policy Supporting Research Group, a consortium of Belgian universities, aims to provide science-based policy support to the Department of Development Cooperation of the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, specifically with regard to issues related to human rights and development cooperation. The group is supported by RSCCD, the Inter-University Funding Agency. The Working Group on Human Rights and Sustainable Development was formed in the context of the World Bank Global Forum on Law, Justice and Development. The working group explores the legal, policy, and operational links between human rights and sustainable development, with a focus on the Sustainable Development Goals and SDGs 16 in particular. The working group is coordinated by the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, the World Bank Human Rights Inclusion and Empowerment Umbrella Program, the World Bank Legal Vice Presidency, and the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, of which I am the Deputy Director. Through a series of activities such as research reports, workshops, and webinars as we have today, we aim to create and share knowledge on a series of topics related to the broad theme of human rights and sustainable development, including topics related to a human rights-based approach to development cooperation. We aim to create a forum for exchanging best practices, ideas, and tools dedicated to the operationalization and implementation of a human rights-based approach to development cooperation. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the speaker of today, Ms. Christine Lundberg, who will present to us the EU's toolbox on a human rights-based approach to development cooperation. Christine Lundberg is a national expert, as I said, working at DG INTAP, and is also with the Swedish International Development Cooperation, and she has worked for more than 30 years on human rights, democratic governance, and development issues, and both in government and in civil society, and she's been based in many different parts of the world, so she is a leading expert on the topic and can help us understand the EU toolbox. Don't forget, if you have questions, please feed them into us. And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Christine. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you very much, Axel. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are. And thank you, Axel, for inviting me to do this presentation on the human rights-based approach. Maybe we could start with the slides, please. I will, maybe the next one, please. So first I will present the background a little bit on the EU's commitments to the human rights-based approach. And then I will talk a bit on why we have done this update. I will explain what is new and show parts of it to you. In parallel, we have also developed a virtual version of the toolbox, and it was actually just recently finalized this month and been posted online. So I will also give you a quick glance on what it looks like. And we will end with a question and answer session, as Axel mentioned. Next, please. So the EU's commitment to the rights-based approach was outlined already in 2012 in its strategic framework on human rights and democracy. It was then followed, as Axel already mentioned, in 2014 by the toolbox called a rights-based approach encompassing all human rights for EU development cooperation. It was followed by Council conclusions welcoming the adoption of the toolbox, and the Council conclusions also commits both the EU and its member states to apply the human rights-based approach to development cooperation. Next, please. Since 2018, we have been working with an integrated approach, combining the human rights-based approach with gender mainstreaming. It can be visualized through this beautiful, colorful tree, where the trunks represent the two approaches and methodologies, and the leaves represent all the human rights and all the human beings. The idea is that this comprehensive methodology will reinforce, on one hand, the human rights-based approach by making it more gender responsive. And on the other hand, the gender mainstreaming becomes more rights-based. So this integrated approach helps to put the individuals, the rights holders, and their rights at the center of our interventions, making sure no one is left behind. The reason for taking this approach are first, that gender equality and women's rights are a natural and integrated part of human rights and the HRBA, and the two approaches mutually reinforce each other. We obtain synergies between gender mainstreaming and the HRBA, and not the least, mainstreaming becomes simplified for our colleagues, because we have many different topics to mainstream, so if we can simplify for them, it is good. Next, please. So the toolbox has then been updated to align with core EC policies and strategies. And there has been many new developments since the old toolbox, both within the EU and internationally. So within the EU, there are two main entry points calling for the application of the human rights-based approach. First, we have the European Consensus on Development, Our World, Our Dignity, Our Future, which was adopted in 2017, and it calls clearly for the application of the human rights-based approach. And then we have the new Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, the NDC Global Europe, that calls for applying the human rights-based approach as a compulsory requirement in the programming and implementation of all our interventions, including for blending and guarantees. So the update of the 2014 toolbox was also requested by several instances, including various action plans and recent council conclusions, communications, and strategies. Next, please. As the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development did not exist when we first developed it, there was really a need to align to the SDGs and also to reflect other policy and strategy commitments, as mentioned. The preamble to the 2030 Agenda states that SDGs seek to realize human rights for all. The agenda is grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as international human rights treaties and labor rights conventions. The respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights are prerequisites to advancing sustainable development. It has been shown that over 90% of the SDGs targets are embedded in human rights treaties. So implementing human rights contributes to realizing SDG targets. The updated toolbox has a whole paragraph on the SDGs and human rights with a strong focus on SDG 5 on gender equality and on SDG 10 on inequalities. The guiding principle of the 2030 agenda is to reach those who are furthest behind first, especially the women and men, girls and boys in all their diversity, living in the most vulnerable situations. This principle is summed up by the pledge to leave no one behind, which is what the HRBA operationalizes in practice. The HRBA also focuses extensively on gender and gender equality as one of the priority areas of the EU, and it links to the new Gender Action Plan #3. Inequalities is a third pillar on which the new HRBA toolbox is funded. The toolbox refers to SDG 10.1. By 2030, progressively achieve and sustain income growth of the bottom 40% of the population at a rate higher than the national average. Next, please. So what is new with this updated toolbox? First, the issues of inequalities, non-discrimination, and gender equality have been integrated and made visible. Now it is more inclusive. We put a strong focus on addressing all inequalities, including gender and disability, for instance. It aligns with international language, human rights-based approach, instead of, as the EU said before, the rights-based approach encompassing all human rights. So this was clearly a change to call it now as the UN and other actors human rights-based approach. And very importantly, it is much more practical. It has plenty of tools, tips, and examples so as to demystify the approach and to help colleagues to apply it. It is more user-friendly also, as it follows the intervention logic. It places equal importance on the purpose, process, and outcome of EU external action. And it shall be applied in all sectors, in all countries, and along the phases of the intervention cycle, from identification and programming through implementation to monitoring and evaluation. Next, please. So how do we follow up and ensure the application within our development cooperation? First of all, we continue to train our staff at delegations around the world and at headquarters. We have an integrated and coherent training package that we call gender responsive human rights based approach. We can also provide technical assistance to colleagues in the process of drafting programs, projects, calls for proposals, etc. And very important, we have an internal quality review process whereby all new interventions and projects are screened from a human rights-based approach perspective and a gender perspective. We are also working on integrating human rights-based approach and gender mainstreaming in all our working procedures, staff working documents, guidelines, templates, etc. And we are now also in the process of developing a self-paced training course so that colleagues will be able to learn about the HRBA whenever it suits them. The e-learning will be posted on our INTPA Academy, where it is also accessible for all for non-EU staff, as long as you register and create an account on INTPA Academy. And I will share the link on a slide a little bit later on. Next, please. We use 5 working principles to apply the human rights-based approach, and they have been slightly reworded to become more inclusive. So the underlined words on the slide that you can see are the additions that make them more inclusive than before. Applying all human rights for all. This working principle acknowledges that human rights are legally binding state obligations and calls for all development interventions to consider all human rights for all individuals. Meaningful and inclusive participation and access to decision-making. Inclusive and meaningful participation is both a means and an end in itself. It means putting individuals at the center of our action by empowering them to identify and help to address the main obstacles and structural barriers that prevent them from achieving their rights. Non-discrimination and equality. Non-discrimination is a legal obligation. It requires supporting the state to address discrimination with specific laws, policies, and institutional measures, and to be accountable for violations. Accountability and rule of law for all. Accountability means holding state institutions to the very highest standard in terms of realizing and protecting individuals' human rights. It also involves providing accessible, transparent, and effective mechanisms of accountability. And last but not least, transparency and access to information supported by disaggregated data. Transparency and access to information is linked to the principles of meaningful participation and accountability. It is about making information, policies, and interventions accessible to all stakeholders. And without information, no accountability. Next, please. So in short, just a recap of what the human rights-based approach is about. It strengthens the capacities of duty bearers, state actors, to fulfill their human rights obligations. Their human rights obligations and gender equality commitments. It raises the awareness of rights holders about their human rights and strengthens their capacities to claim those rights. It incorporates gender into planning, implementation, and monitoring, promoting gender equality and addressing discrimination and inequality. It prevents harmful outcomes from development interventions by incorporating the do no harm principle. And it anchors development policies within a framework of laws, norms, and standards. Through the application of a human rights-based approach, our interventions will deliver more relevant and sustained results, while strengthening national ownership, accountability, and meaningful participation. Next, please. The toolbox is divided in 2 parts. The first one is explaining what the human rights-based approach is, the rationale behind the 5 working principles, etc. And the second part is the practical part that follows the phases of programming, as mentioned, and designing and implementation of interventions. So I will continue. We can have the next slide, please. So the toolbox is organized following our internal intervention cycle, so it becomes easy to follow and in a logical structure for our colleagues. In parallel, we have also developed this virtual version, which is interactive with many links and tools and examples. The online version is meant really for practitioners, and it is meant to be user-friendly and easy to navigate. I will quickly show you the virtual version after this PowerPoint presentation. Next one, please. This is an example of a tool for context analysis that we always have to carry out. So by clicking on the buttons at the bottom, tips on where to find information will pop up, like this one suggesting to look for the national human rights institutions. Next one, please. We use both internal and external resources. This one is from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, and it's a tool for context and policy analysis. And it's really an excellent tool with a lot of information, both per country and per issue. So you can find information on what conventions a country has ratified. You can find their state reporting. You can find the concluding observations on the country. So there's really a lot of information. Haven't you visited this site before? I really suggest you do, to learn about the country you're interested in, or your own, because this is globally, it's about all the countries. Next, please. Another tool that we have in our toolbox is this one from the Danish Institute for Human Rights. This is an independent state-funded institution. They are Denmark's national human rights institution and also the national equality body. This tool shows the links between specific SDGs and the related human rights. It also shows country-specific information regarding the SDGs and human rights. It's also a very rich resource. Next, please. This tool is for analyzing stakeholders' engagement in an intervention. I will not go into the tools. I just want to show you some of them briefly. So next one, please. Here's another tool for stakeholder analysis. Throughout the toolbox, we have developed an imaginary migration project that we use to illustrate different tools. So in this example, for instance, we have used it to illustrate how to carry out the stakeholder analysis and to find out about the capacity strengthening needs of the different stakeholders. Next, please. So here we have a tool for problem analysis. By clicking on the different options, yes or no, you will get suggestions on how to improve the problem analysis for the intervention. So, for example, if the action does not address structural barriers, discrimination, and inequalities, click on the no button, and an example or suggestion pops up how you can improve it. Next, please. This tool is really it recaps the intervention logic from the problem and stakeholder analysis to the risk analysis, looking to suggested objectives, outputs, and activities. And it's presented through the imaginary migration example, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have come to the end of my PowerPoint presentation. I mentioned that the toolbox is available for all on the INTPA Academy website. On this link, it will be shared with you in the chat in a moment. Everyone has access as long as you register and create your own account. Each person from an institution, for instance, need to have their own account. So I will now go on to share my screen to show you the online toolbox, what it looks like. So let me see if I manage this. Okay, so now this is the welcoming page on the human rights-based approach, the virtual version of our toolbox. Here we explain how to use this toolbox and its content. So I can scroll down just to show you, and we find links here. You will find the link to the formal staff working document that was adopted by the Commission, and who is the toolbox for, when to use it. There's a lot of scrolling, so I will go to the content page on the left-hand side. Here we have the table of content, and I will show you a few of the things I have spoken about. I will click on the human rights-based approach 5 working principles. And here, when I scroll down, there's a bit of an explanation. We have integrated gender equality. And here we have the 5 working principles. And if you click on them, you will get an explanation of what they contain, what it is. This is about transparency and access to information. And if I continue to scroll down, we find flip cards. And these, each one of them has an example on how the specific working principle has been applied in an EU-funded project. So we can click on the transparency. So here is a global monitor of the COVID's impact on human rights and democracy. It is with sources and links. So here you can find how it can be applied in different areas. And these are from real projects that we do have or are funding. If I scroll a little bit further down on the 5 working principles, we come to a little short video. I will not show it to you, but just to show you the richness of the tools and examples we provide. So this is a little fishing project that applies the 5 working principles to get better results and outcomes of their project. I go to the left-hand side again, and I will click on Leave No One Behind, addressing discrimination and inequalities. So here we will find explanation of inequalities and discrimination. And as you know, there are multiple forms of discrimination, often called intersectionality. And in order to understand this a little bit better, we have a flower to illustrate some grounds of discrimination and how that may impact human rights. So if I click here, you see that income and poverty could be one ground for discrimination. Another one is belonging to an indigenous, indigenous peoples. There is an explanation, and in some cases we also have tools. Here we have the Indigenous Navigator, which is a tool on and for indigenous people. Another ground for discrimination is disability, as we spoke about previously. Here we have links to the WHO and to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Oops, something happened. I don't know what happened, sorry. I hope you can see my screen again. I don't know what happened, sorry for that. So I wanted to also show you what we have in the center, and that is the gender as a transversal category that intersects with all other forms of discrimination. So this is an the flower, we call it, to show many different grounds on discrimination, and it's multiplied by being a woman, for instance. Then I continue on the left-hand side to look at other tools. So as you know, we have to mainstream gender in everything we do. And we have to classify all intervention according to the OECD gender markers. So here we have an explanation also of what this gender marker is. The gender marker is explained. Here we have it. Gender marker 2, score 2, score 1, or 0 score. So here people can, colleagues working on their interventions, if they are not sure, they will look at the human rights-based approach, but they can also immediately find information on the gender marker, because this is an obligation for us to always classify the interventions that we are preparing. And the same goes for disability, where we have disability marker that we also have to classify in the same way, with links and the scores. And then I just wanted to show you at the end, first we have a checklist for our colleagues for applying the human rights-based approach. Then we have a very rich list of resources and links. We have EU resources on different topics, and we have international resources as well. I will not show it all to you, but there's really a rich flora of different resources. And at the very end, we have something that I think is a little bit funny. We made this for our colleagues to check, so they can check themselves if they know and understand what the human rights-based approach is. So there's a little quiz here that we can test our knowledge. So can you identify one of the HRBA's 5 working principles? So let's say exclusion. No, the HRBA promotes the participation and inclusion of all. Exclusion is not a working principle. Try again. So we try again. And now we say participation. And that is correct. So with this, I end my presentation. And I will hand the floor over to Axel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christine, for a very comprehensive and interesting presentation, and also for presenting a very elaborate tool which you have developed and which is available and online for all of those interested. And you touched upon a lot of different topics and issue areas, and I'm sure people are interested in hearing maybe some further details on some of these aspects. So everybody feel free to type in questions which you might have, and then I can pose them to Christine, but maybe allow me to kick off with a few questions on what I've heard, and maybe also to delve into some things a bit more deeper. So you presented the human rights-based approach and the different principles on which it's based, and I think it's an excellent starting point if you want to start developing a human rights-based approach as a policy strategy in the first hand. But there's also, I think, an important component to a human rights-based approach in terms of integrating it in very concrete development cooperation projects, which you implement on the ground. And my first question is a bit related to that. Does the toolbox also, let's say, integrate examples very concretely how the human rights-based approach, for example, is integrated in infrastructure projects or in other types of projects? And can we also find that on the toolbox?
Yes, there are different examples of both how it's integrated in different sectors. Actually, I didn't show that to you, but we have the 5 working principles explained or given as examples for the 5 priority areas of the Commission, which is the Green Deal, digitalization, migration, etc. So here we have given the concrete examples, because many times it is precisely colleagues working on sectors that not immediately are connected to gender equality or human rights issues. So we wanted to show that those approaches are relevant in all sectors. It really has to be applied everywhere. So we have those examples, absolutely, yes.
Okay, thank you. And maybe a very practical question, because you showed in the presentation also on the website, YouTube films which are available, a lot of documents which are available on implementing a human rights-based approach. Is there a way through which colleagues who are listening now and who maybe also have interesting examples to share them with you, and can they also be included in the toolbox? In other words, is there any mechanism, let's say, to feed the toolbox with more examples and more lessons learned, maybe even some best practices? And if that would be the case, how can we go about that?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. Yes, we have now done the toolbox is really mirroring the formal document that was adopted by the Commission. But we see the online version more as a living document that will be updated. So if you have suggestions and examples, please send them to me. I think we will not do anything during a year or so. We will have to let it land, so to say. Mm-hmm. But afterwards, there will be, I hope, a revision and update.
Okay. And in the meantime, I'm already receiving some questions. And Freya asks whether a human rights-based approach will also be integrated in the trade and investment policies of the European Union. And if you know what the approach would be in that respect.
This toolbox is really made for the international partnerships and for the development cooperation. So trade and investment is handled by another DG, and they are not obliged to apply the toolbox. But when for colleagues working in INTPA on trade issues in the development context, yes. So there is a difference here.
All right. So in let's say in the areas where the DG for development cooperation comes in within a trading partner of the EU, and it develops online or on the ground projects related to technical capacity building and these types of things, in those areas a human rights based approach is integrated.
I think if DG INPA is managing it, yes. Okay. If another DG is doing it, no. So it is the development cooperation that has to do this when we use the NDK Global Europe funds.
Okay. I also received a question related to maybe, let's say, call it target groups within a human rights-based approach. We talked about women, we talked about people with a disability, but Sebastian is also asking whether there are specific tools which look at young people and youth, and let's say some of the human rights related aspects to young people, and whether there are specific tools developed for that, and if there are specific tools developed for young people, whether they are also integrated in the toolbox.
Participation is for all. And with that, we mean all those that are affected by an intervention. there is no specific tool that I recall at this stage specifically directed to you young people, but they are many times a large group of individuals that are affected. So in that sense, yes. Also, of course, when we talk about not only having individuals participating, but also they often are represented by civil society. So of course, it is organizations for youth, organizations for women, organizations for laborers, you know, trade unions, etc. So for all those different kinds of target groups.
It's linked to the previous question and something which you also mentioned during the presentation. One of the key principles of a human rights-based approach is effective participation by people in development cooperation projects and the development of policies and so on. Does the toolbox offer, let's say, very concrete guidelines on what to do or how to do or how to organize effective participation? Because it's on the one hand an interesting principle, but on the other hand, if we want to implement it really on the ground, it's not always easy, it's not always straightforward. And are there any, let's say, lessons learned or best practices which we can consider or which we can find in the toolbox?
There are examples of how this has been done in different projects from different countries. So there are, throughout the toolbox, there are examples provided. And also in the resources list that I mentioned, there are also references to different tools, and all those are live links, so you can reach all of them to get more. Yeah.
And a related question, not specifically on the toolbox, but more in general on the human rights-based approach, is we have now the EU initiative and leadership in that respect. Also, several EU member states are developing a human rights-based approach to development cooperation. But can you say maybe a bit more about the developments within EU member states? Because if I recall well, not all EU member states are already, let's say, applying a human rights-based approach. Some of them are really leading in that respect. And what is a little bit the state of play in that respect?
Thank you for that question. Actually, we have a close collaboration with member states. We have a little informal experts group from the member states where we exchange experiences, etc. We have collected information from each member state on where they are regarding their application of human rights-based approach, and we have created brief country briefs on each country, approved by respective country, respective government, and those are also posted on our INFA Academy. The intention is really to support each other, so not everyone has to invent the wheel and start all over. That's why we have created the toolbox. We make everything available for everyone. There's also a link in the toolbox to these country briefs where you can read about each of the member states, where they are, what policies they have, and links to their strategic documents and tools. So there's a lot of exchange, and when we presented this new toolbox and the online version, some of the member states said that, oh, this was great, they will actually use it. And others are more advanced, and they were happy that we aligned the language with human rights-based approach and not the, yeah, as I explained. So there are different levels, as you say, but we really hope this will help the member states to have a push forward.
Related to that, and you also mentioned it at the beginning, and a very important part of the exercise is also the training and getting everybody to, let's say, up to speed with the core principles and what a human rights-based approach is about. And you mentioned in your presentation the different trainings you are developing, are they also already available online? You mentioned an e-training course.
No, well, we do trainings for our EU delegations. So previously we did them in country, but since a year and a half, of course, we have to turn to this online mood. So we do online trainings with delegations. In some cases, it's up to the delegation to invite member states to participate, for instance. But those trainings are not put online. They are available for the delegation. And then we have some training held on more general basis. We have, for instance, just had a webinar presenting the toolbox for our staff, headquarters and delegations. This webinar will be posted on INSPA Academy, so that is available.
Okay.
And you will post this one, I understand, so it will also be available.
Very good. Maybe a bit of a more challenging question that relates to the whole idea of a human rights-based approach, and you nicely outlined the key focus, but we also know that maybe not everybody is convinced that this is maybe the best approach to take. And what are, according to you, some of the major challenges which need to be overcome to convince people of the necessity of a human rights-based approach to development cooperation?
Yeah, I think there are different levels of the challenges. I think each organization needs to be convinced and have a clear mandate and a clear direction that this is what we have to do, and everybody needs to be on board. Sometimes the understanding what it actually is, what the human rights-based approach means, is everybody thinks they know what it is, but it's not necessarily the case. And sometimes it's challenging with sectors that we talked about before, energy or infrastructure, that is not necessarily seen as having anything to do with human rights or gender equality. So of course, you need to think a little bit in another way when you take this approach on board. And that might be disturbing. It might take a little bit longer, more time. So that is, of course, one of the challenges. And then we need to have management on board also to request and require this. And I think that with the new financing instrument, the NDK Global Europe, where it's clearly stated that this has to be applied to all our interventions, there is not much to say that you don't want to do it, because it has to be done. And then we have this quality review process, as I mentioned, where we support our colleagues in how they can do it, etc. But it takes time. It takes time. And what would be ideal, what we recommend is also that this quality review process happens at headquarter level. When delegations have developed their program, they send it to headquarters and it's assessed there. It would be good if the delegations at their level could have their own internal quality assessment before sending, so it would really put a pressure locally as well. That is what we suggest, but it's not up to us to decide on these things.
Thank you. And maybe related to that, and I don't know if it's already considered in the context of the toolbox, are there any, let's say, ideas about one way of monitoring the degree to which the human rights-based approach is really implemented? Any, let's say, maybe not statistics, but indicators or pieces of information which can be used to assess whether it's implemented, and maybe even a step further to look at what the impact is of a human rights-based approach?
We have an annual report that has to be elaborated each year. It's called the External Action Monitoring Report or something like that. And there we have managed to include a few questions regarding the human rights-based approach. So that will be monitored at an annual level on that, in that sense. Then also we collect data when we revise the proposals that pass through our quality review process. So there are different ways of monitoring this. But I believe, to be frank, that we need to think a little bit more on how to report and monitor this.
Any ideas on how to improve the monitoring?
Pardon?
Do you have any ideas on how to, let's say, improve the monitoring or implement the monitoring?
No, I think it will be, we need to maybe have, like we have the gender marker, we have the disability marker. I'm not sure that the marker is the way of doing it, but maybe we need to think about how could we improve the follow-up of this. Should there be, yeah, no, I don't know, but we have to think about it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are nearing the end of our webinar. I have a question coming in from Freya, and she asks whether the toolbox or part of it is available in different languages.
The formal toolbox so far is only in English, but it will be translated to both French and Spanish. The old toolbox, we also had it in the 3 languages. The online version, I am not sure. I don't think so. We will see. But the formal staff working document, yes.
And with regard to, let's say, the resources or the documents which are included in the toolbox, they can come maybe also from different member states in different languages. Will they be included in those languages in the toolbox?
I believe you have to go to the website. I mean, you click on the link, and the way we have developed the toolbox in English. So we have the links in English, but if you go to the site, maybe it's possible to change language. I mean, it depends on the where you go. If you're in UN, you have many languages. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very interesting webinar and for introducing the EU toolbox. We also already posted the hyperlink in the chat, so we hope people pick it up and also explore it. And I also assume that if they maybe have further questions, we can put them in contact with you. I know there's quite some interest in these training materials, either for in-person training, but also you mentioned the self-paced training tools you are developing, which can be disseminated and can be used widely. And I think there is a lot of interest for people to learn more about what more concretely is a human rights-based approach to develop. So thank you very much for your time and for your explanation and for all the interesting material you provided us with. You also mentioned the tool which is developed by the Danish Institute on the SDGs and human rights. And that tool will actually be presented in our next webinar.
Really?
Take place on the 27th of October. And I invite everybody here in the webinar to also join us then. So from that point of view, I'm going to end the webinar here. I want to thank Christine very much again for the presentation. I want to thank you all for tuning in, for your questions and your interest in the human rights-based approach toolbox of the EU. And we hope to see you soon again at the next webinar on the 27th of October related to human rights and the SDGs, the toolbox developed by the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Thank you and have a very nice evening, morning or afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.